Well, here we are with Allan Zuckoff and Tom Barth after a wonderful presentation on engagement. Really pushed all of us to think, I think, a lot deeper about what engagement means and what is going on both for the clinician and for the client. So, so maybe we could just kind of briefly start capturing some of that content that we just learned. So what maybe a question for you all, what led you to think about this as a topic for today?
Well, we started thinking about that engagement. Everybody can recognize the necessity of it and that it's a requisite for sort of going further and change work. But we started to be interested in the structure of it. And it's not just intuitive, but there actually is perhaps some kind of a structure, so we should be able to describe that structure.
And I found as I began sort of thinking about this, not taking it for granted, because I think it's easy to think we just know what engaging is. It's the most straightforward and common of the processes in the sense of common across counseling approaches, that as I first shared some of my thoughts with Tom and then with a couple of others, I found that what I was saying about how I teach engaging and how I think about it was not exactly what they were saying about how they teach it and think about it. And that got me, and I think both of us, really interested in saying, well, maybe it's not quite so obvious and straightforward. Maybe there would be value in digging into it in a way and really trying to tease out our different thoughts about how this works.
Okay. So in some ways it sounds like it's almost a process within the processes. And that by having this conversation, you began to identify. We all think we've gone to the same place, but in the conversation we're having, we're in a similar region, but where we understand ourselves to be is slightly different. And that raised your curiosity that has led to this conversation that you're having here with us today about where is this place and what is it that makes us go towards this place, or how do we know we've arrived in this place?
Well, I think what place we're getting to, but also how we're getting there.
Right.
And how we're thinking about how we get to that place of having engaged. I think there are differences among us, and these are all very experienced MI trainers who I was talking with, differences among us in thinking about, well, how do we actually make that happen? And I thought that was really surprising to me initially, and then very interesting after that.
Yeah, and we wanted to make it clear that engagement is not just having a nice chat before we start working. It's actually perhaps the most difficult or the hardest work in the entire consultation is establishing the kind of working relationship that will be helpful for the change work later.
And I think, piggybacking on that thought, one of the things that makes it as challenging as it is that particularly in MI, because we're typically doing brief or very brief conversations, is that we need to be able to do this quickly. Right? So we don't have 15, 25, 35 sessions over 6 months or a year typically. We might meet with a person once or twice. We might have 15 minutes. If we have 45 minutes, that's a luxury in many cases. And so if we're going to do the rest of the work that we are there to do, we have to be able to engage quite quickly and efficiently. And I think that was behind some of Bill and Steve's comments in MI3, that this can take minutes or even seconds. Now, I'm not sure that it happens in seconds very often. I think that's an interesting idea, but certainly minutes is typical. I mean, the two clips that we showed in our session were about 3 to 4 to 5 minutes each of engaging before the practitioner is moving on or beginning to do something else as well. And how do you do it that quickly and effectively to be able to move into the sort of the meat of the process in the sense of building motivation and commitment for change?
Especially that's important in the cases where the client is not very happy to be there, or angry, or defensive or almost ready to move out, you need to do the engagement very, very quickly and not talk about any sort of other things. You have to go straight there.
Yeah, as I'm listening, it is really interesting to have the understanding, the awareness that engagement is so vital, so important. Without it, there's really nothing else. And at the same time, it's something that there's this sort of mystery around, and just how important this process of examining this process a little bit more closely is to get at some of these really key elements and to really be able to say with some certainty, this is what engagement is.
Yeah, I think, we've tended, following Bill and Steve, to say, certainly when I teach it, it's about being empathic, it's about being autonomy supportive, it's about conveying a partnership, the things that we, associate with MI spirit, and I certainly think those are all at the heart of the engaging process. But I think compared with the focus on the technical side, a lot of the research and a lot of the sort of what exactly is change talk, how does it work, is it intensity, is it frequency, is it the slope of change talk over the course of right? We have a lot of strategies for evoking, for responding to, for elaborating change talk. I think we haven't necessarily dedicated that same level of research and careful thought to the process of engaging. We've relied on the existing ideas from client-centered counseling and about spirit, and I do think that it merits more of those kinds of focuses to really be able to articulate what are the specific things to do and not do, how do you know when the person is engaged enough such that you can begin to focus, what signs, what are the markers on the part of the client, can we measure engagement, and the engaging this would be beyond just empathy and partnership, the way we measure cultivating change talk when we're thinking about the evoking process. I think there are a lot of those kinds of questions that would bear greater attention from us.
Yeah, so very exciting opportunity, and it sounds like as you've opened the lid on this, the more you've discovered just how deep this process or this exploration could go for everyone, that given the significance of engagement, there is no point in knowing how to create change talk if you haven't engaged. And the more we understand this engagement process, the easier it will be then for us as trainers, but also very importantly for us as practitioners, to know the what and the how, including the mechanics of it. But what was interesting in your presentation as well was the idea of, Tom, you talked about that intuitive aspect of the practitioner, and in the definitions that you offered, there was the notion of the bond. And when we were talking in a small group, the word intimacy came up. That the intimacy of the relationship, that's part of the engagement, that the client articulates that, who is this person, can I feel safe with them, for me to be with them. So it sounds like there's an aspect for us as practitioners to learn. It's about, can we feel, how do we tolerate the experience of intimacy with a client, and how do we contain that emotional, cognitive experience of another person in the relationship as part of understanding the engagement. So, it sounds like you've really opened up a massive piece of exploration, and I heard you've been offered the opportunity to do some coding of that. So, and it sounds like that's potentially where this may lead to. As part of that process will be that you hope that at some point we can code this process, because it is tangible at some level. But that's not important, but it's the connection that you're creating.
Well, I think at some level that is, in fact, that's where, for me, the very beginning of this process was a trainer on my training team asking me that question. Do we have a way of coding and of measuring engaging the same way we code and measure the evoking process through cultivating change talk, and the focusing process through Nina Gobat's scales that she's begun to develop? And after initially saying, well, we code empathy, we code partnership, and then stopping and thinking, but empathy and partnership are always there. They're not only part of the engaging process. And engaging, I think, might be more than just empathy and partnership. So what I realized was my answer was no, we don't exactly have a way to code or measure that, and that sort of led to these kinds of questions about, well, what is it exactly? First, we have to agree on what it is and how we do it, and if we're going to think about, all right, now let's figure out how to measure it, how to code it, much less how are we going to teach it.
And I think it has become clearer and clearer to me in our discussions, Allan, that the depth of engagement also dictates the degree of change after change talk. So you actually can increase the effect of good motivational interviewing by being sure that the engagement is strong enough.
It reminds me of the piece that you were talking about with the depth, and you were sort of wondering about the x-axis being sustained talk and change talk, and then there was maybe some role for a y-axis around depth. Maybe you could share some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's not really my idea, so that's Ali Hall.
Sure.
But, yeah. No, it does make sense that you could talk about working relationship, and the better the working relationship functions, the more effect the work will have. And so a piece of change talk, if it is just uttered sort of blah, 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 doesn't work as much on future behavior as the same words, same change talk, when they are accompanied by a deep personal feeling. And that's what we're establishing, the deep personal connection or intimacy or whatever word you use at the very beginning of conversation.
I do love that word, intimacy, and it's for this process and for what we actually experience with our clients when we feel engaging happening in a really powerful way. And I think that I love that idea of emotional depth, that this may be another place where I think about some of Chris Wagner and Karen Ingersoll's thoughts about bringing affect and emotion into MI in a way more than we often have it. That if we talk about engagement as a cognitive process, or the working relationship as an agreement or a sense of, yes, we're going to do the same thing together and we have a goal and plan, I think that's clearly an important part of it. But it does seem very important that whether you call it the bond, whether you call it a trusting and mutually trusting and respectful relationship, that there is an emotional, or has to be an emotional component to that. And I don't know that we talk about that as much when we're training, when we're thinking about MI and how it works. And I think maybe that's another way where that needs to be brought in more clearly.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind is that you're describing something that the change is taking place in relation. It's a relational experience, and both the internal relationship or relating the client has with themselves, but also then that dynamic that's taking place between you and the practitioner. And again, probably what we've described as well is the relationship that the practitioner has with themselves. So there's your relationship, my relationships, and then there's our relationship, and how attuned the practitioner is to those different elements will influence their ability to be available to what the client needs.
Yes.
Wow.
We talk about trust, and we use that word casually, and we all know what it means. But I think what it really means to trust another person, to trust another person in the way that we want our clients to trust us when we are working with them, such that they are feeling safe enough to let down the ways they protect themselves from feeling bad about themselves, from their own internal struggle. And we talk about developing discrepancy. There is nothing more painful than openly, and not just thinking, but saying out loud to another person, this is who I want to be, who I believe I should be. and this is who I am, and they are very far apart. And I am failing myself, I am failing the people I love. That is an exceptionally difficult thing to even think, much less to say out loud. And I think that kind of trust, the idea that we can establish that kind of trust is relatively quickly is itself fascinating to me, but it's certainly something that you know, is not just a cognitive process.
One of the things that got me started about thinking about this, and it's a couple of years ago, a client came into my room, my working room, and said, I can tell you this, you have less chance than a snowball in hell to make me stop with amphetamines. And I thought, perfect. He's sitting there directly trusting me that I will accept him as he is so we can start working.
So I would say, yeah, I don't think he's trusting. I'm thinking a lot about that point that you've made, Tom, and I'm still wrestling with it. I think you're right that there is a kind of trust, because he could simply pretend, he could simply ignore you, he could simply have done nothing, and he could simply have not come into your office. I think what he's doing is offering a test of trust. That is, by saying that, he's very closely attuned to what are you going to do about that? And it's your passing that test of trust by accepting it, by taking the attitude you just described, that you hear that and what you feel is not, oh, this guy is a jerk, or I don't want to work with this person, but wonderful, this is exactly what I want to hear. He's being out there with me, and I'm going to meet him and respect him and try to understand him, is precisely the passing of that test that he is offering that allows for the possibility of a step towards trust and a step towards genuine safety and engagement.
And of course we're moving into a different discussion now because MI is also constructing reality. So when I choose to understand him as open and direct and honest, it becomes trust instead of suspicion. So, but that's a different discussion. So perhaps the next forum, Allan, we can go.
Right, we know what the next presentation you guys will give. So again, as is always the case, we could keep going and going. This has been fascinating, both the presentation and hear the sort of the afterthoughts of it. We're in a big room right now for those who can't see us, and we're about to have the board meeting, I think, in about 10 minutes.
Yes.
So we probably need to wrap things up.